Mystery, history, cryptid creatures, and paranormal activities. This is the Creeps and Crawls Mystery Hour podcast, and I'm your host, Creeps.
What's up? And welcome to episode 2 of the Vampires. Now, this episode will cover everything from the early 1900s to gothic vampire clubs in the 1980s to the early 2000s, and how these developed during those years, including new stories and movies that inspired the gothic trends that surrounded these eras' culture. This episode is 2 out of 3 and will be long, so I do suggest grabbing your favorite snack, a fluffy blanket, and cuddling up with a pillow. Also, if you could check out our channel description and links to get more content from our channel, I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much if you do. Now, let's begin. Since Bram Stoker created the illustrious Dracula in 1869, our culture has started to romanticize the once bloodthirsty and terrifying monster vampires were seen as. In the beginning of the 1900s, vampires became more popular to read about. They still had the terrifying aspects to them, like drinking blood, and some even tearing you to pieces to get it. But as they grew more popular into the 1920s, they became less scary and more of something of interest, and more of a sexual nature to some. With them now, instead of tearing their victims apart or draining them invisibly, to them and to the readers with them, they started drinking through the neck, through their now popular fangs, which, if you didn't know, are extended canines coming from the upper jaw. But images and portrayals and drawings of them bent over a female with fangs in their neck became more intimate, and an image causing people to start sexualizing and romanticizing the modern vampire. The first of these images actually was produced in 1895 and was called Love and Pain and was produced by Edvard Munch. He had made this particular painting on multiple occasions, but this last is the most, if not the biggest, vampirism uprising painting you could come by. It's of a woman with flaming hair shrouded in darkness, gray-faced over a gentleman. Munch explained it as she was just kissing a man on the neck as the couple embraced, despite his claims of the woman not being a vampire. Many people associated this painting with vampires so much, the secondary name for this painting became vampire, and inspired many early novellas about vampires. Some of these titles are The Blonde Vampire by D.Sekaya Morse, The Young Vampire by J.H. Rosny Ain, and The Supernatural Assassin also by J.H. Rosny Ain. These books became super popular and led to a new rise of more risk literature depicting the vampire in a more romanticized nature. Also around this time, there were a series of movies about a certain vampire called Nosferatu, and it became highly popular, as well as Bela Lugosi and something called The Genuine Tragedy of a Vampire. In these, it gave a more timeless version of the vampire, making them out to be immortals with a sadder background, and also bringing that monster trope to light. Nosferatu was a very genuinely lovable vampire figure, kinda looking like Uncle Fester from the Addams Family, which was actually a popular comic from around the same time, meaning 1938, before the show aired in 1964, which also mostly depicted Fester as a sort of vampire-like creature, as he rose from his bed in a similar fashion as Nosferatu rose from a coffin. But Fester had some other odd powers, such as being able to light a light bulb with his mouth and setting off bombs in close proximity to himself without dying, even sometimes on his own body. I love to think he was also part of the resurgence of the romanticized vampire with how he was. And knowing the Addams family, they were supposed to be this family that was outside of the norm and complete in utter audacity. The kids, they would chop each other to bits and not die and have the same body parts. And Morticia and Gomez were kind of like these romanticized vampire-esque characters. Even their home portrayed this kind of eerie vibe that there was something just not right about them. Even the neighborhood knew. And I feel like this kind of made other people belong. Like, even if they were outside of the norm of most other people, they would be accepted for being like these people, for being different, for going out there and trying new things and doing new things and liking different things from what the community liked. Because they saw themselves in these characters. It was the first time something outside of the norm was being shown regularly on TV. And another one of these, things was Grandpa Munster from the Munsters. He was a very comedic vampire who used satire in every word he said. He was very comedic, making the once ancient vampire even less threatening. And to say it in the least, hysterical. He had a lot of risk comedy for the time, as well as also dropping in 1964, shortly after the Addams Family aired. Their family was made up of monsters who acted regular, and they had a regular family dynamic, which was different than the Addams Family, but they still looked different from most people on TV. Lily Munster, the patriarch of the Munster family, was also a vampire, and she had a little more of a stern appearance, as well as being a protective mother of her son, Eddie Munster, a young werewolf, much like her brother, which was portrayed in the earlier episodes of the show, but not frequently enough to be remembered, causing some to forget his existence, convincing some people that either Lily cheated on Herman or he was adopted. But when the newer movie by Rob Zombie dropped in 2022, we got a resurgence of her rock star, entrepreneurial, and gambling older brother, Lester Dracula. And many were reminded of this very classy yet irresponsible existence. Also, I just had a realization after rewatching the show on multiple occasions. Grandpa states Lily's mother was a real dog, and I don't remember it ever being mentioned, but apparently her mother was mentioned as being a werewolf named Lillian Munster, as well as Lily's maternal grandfather. This kind of comedic monster family trope was meant to show the differences didn't make you a monster, which kind of made a friendlier vampire come out, while still having some scarier vampires. There were several families around this time outside of the usual, though, like Samantha, her mother Endora, and her daughter Caroline, as well as Uncle Arthur, who we will never forget for his general wackiness in Bewitched, a TV show surrounding a young female witch who is trying to hide who she is while being with her husband in the mortal world. But, as we do see, she cannot really hide it. I mean, with the wiggle of her nose, she can get anything done. And as well as Jeannie in I Dream of Jeannie, which were very female-based shows, which was a powerful statement for this time. These may have also led to this gothic kind of resurgence of the vampire, with the idea of the romanticized vampire around the late 60s to early 70s. Some weird things started happening. One of these things was Alice Cooper's drinking club called the Hollywood Vampires. Then, after this, some strange vampire clubs started forming. Then, the film The Lost Boys came out, kind of mixing horror and comedy with the newer immortal aspect of vampires. Thrown in for some class was a teenager named Michael, who just moved into a small town in Northern California. And he's turned into a vampire on accident after a party with vampires. Also, their mom starts dating the head vampire, so kinda weird. Then, spoilers, if for some reason you haven't watched it, which, I mean, come on, it's been years, guys. Go take a look if you haven't. It's a great movie. They kill the head vampire and his cronies, and Michael is no longer a vampire. Now, this trope was actually not a vampire trope. It was originally a werewolf trope, which is why we had gotten into werewolf stuff earlier. Because around this time, all sorts of werewolf movie monster tropes started to be added to vampires to give them more weaknesses or more traits in the long run. Another movie that dropped and added more character was the movie Blade, with the half-human, half-vamp daywalker vampire hunter being made for the TV after being an amazingly popular comic. Anything for vampires really became a reality. This is where vampire raves in society became very popular and kind of just took off. Lore got extensive and started expanding into tons more books and comics and movies. Some that were older but more complex and popular were the Vampire Lestat books by Anne Rice that were adapted into a movie form, one being Interview with a Vampire and the other being The Queen of the Damned. Both followed the Vampire Lestat, a music-loving chaos demon of a vampire and a sexual acolyte who causes havoc in both movies, from raising a child vampire named Claudia that he made for his partner and being absolutely crazy and power-hungry, in the other losing control at the drop of a hat, revealing vampires to the world for a privileged musical fantasy, and awakening Akasha, the vampire queen, who was also very uncontrolled, and another sexualized acolyte portrayed by the deceased Aaliyah. May she rest in peace. Such a wonderful musician and an actress. But also, he, I believe, was the main start to the vampires we see now in our day. The untamed, sexualized demon that's portrayed everywhere. This also helped the music scene to grow with an amazing soundtrack and the thrills of the time. More underground clubs and speakeasies for vampirism grew, so much that they made documentaries on these so-called vampires in our society, where people would go as far as getting permanent veneers and make their whole living based around the so-called living impaired, creating a whole vampire underground. From the so-called Strega to Morai, as well as the energy vampires and blood drinkers. This craze was the highlight of my early years. Everyone wanted to be these immortal bloodsuckers with no control, living only on their desire, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was an everyday thing. It cultivated the gothic, emo, and scene communities to even becoming a household decor and staple. People were mentioning vampires and everything, and it's no surprise these dark creatures of the night caught and sparked so much interest. They were quite the spectacle, and they represented the darkest parts of ourselves, the inner confliction of man, and how everyone eventually will meet our fate, and we will all meet our darker side. It was like remembering that no one's innocence or naivety is forever, but our deepest and darkest desires or sexual depravity can be left up to the imagination with such full force that even when shoved down it causes everybody to think. So what do you think? Tell me down below in the comment section. And join us for episode 3, where we'll be covering what a vampire has been made into from the 2010s and upward. And remember, please stay creepy, my friends.